The second characteristic, according to the United Nations WTO, is, this is short, it contains educational and interpretation features.
Mm-hmm.
Educational and interpretation features. What's your, how does that apply to scuba?
If you look at the diving industry, especially in your open water classes, it's not really too talked about environmental concerns we have for diving. We do talk about the environment and being neutrally buoyant, how we don't want to touch the coral, or just silt up the dive site or whatever it be, but it's not really discussed in the same way that you would in follow up education, or even when you get on a dive boat and you're taking a boat out to a coral reef in Florida or Bahamas, and they say don't mess with the turtles or don't touch the coral reef. Why is that stuff not really emphasized more in open water classes if it does have such an environmental impact and a long term impact on the economics of the industry itself? I pulled up some statistics from Scubanomics, which is a little website that kind of goes into the economic statistical play of the diving industry. And from one of the surveys that was done in 2022, was 79% of the divers surveyed indicated an importance to the environmental awareness of their diving, but only 19% of them stated that their instructors put an emphasis on this awareness in their entry-level course. That's an interesting little tidbit there. It's less than 1/5 of the diving instructors actually emphasized environmental awareness in their open water class.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if another one was 86% of scuba diving instructors surveyed judged environmental awareness to be an important topic, but less than half of them said that their training agency emphasized environmental conservation in the industry. 64% of them were self-taught, most of that information coming from books.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the role that a training agency plays here, because I don't think it's fair to put the onus on the training agency to also be the ecotourism source of truth, right? I think that there's because there's so many diverse ecosystems that we get into, right? And that the agency itself has to kind of absolve itself, because you could be, like in Texas in a lake versus Mexico in a coral reef versus where you're at underneath a boat, somewhere. So there's how do you account for that? And it would be your open water would take you 7 years to complete if you have to account for all of that. I think that where the agency is accountable is two things. One, I think is using it not as, I feel like oftentimes it's not tongue in cheek, but it's kind of not, it's just said for the sake of it's being said. It feels like a cover your ass type of thing, rather than an emphasis of, look, we are going into the wild. And I don't think that is emphasized enough, because there's this idea in a lot of the big box scuba that, we want to make it super unthreatening, and, because that we need to grow the diving industry. And so we need to, basically sugarcoat everything. Everything is sugarcoated in those big box agencies. We don't mention the word, death. To me, that's stupid, because you're not giving people a reality of what they're doing. We are going into a wild environment where we are not, as human beings, equipped to be without some sort of equipment, and anything can happen in that wild. And what we do in that wild environment has an impact on that wild environment. In a national park you go into, and there's a set of rules, right? And regulations and permits, and, and look, don't screw with the bears, because they will do X, Y, and Z to you, right? People have died on this trail, so stay on the trailhead, right? And so there is a responsibility that even the national parks take on, because you're in that wild environment. So I think that there is this issue of, we've traded some of the reality of what we're doing in the training aspect of it for we want it to be super approachable and easy and seem like it's just like, going for a Sunday stroll in the park. And it's not. And so I think that's one area that I do think that agencies, if you're listening to this, can examine and say, are we actually preparing people to be in the wild? Or are we sugarcoating things too far where they don't realize the relationship between diving and the environment that we're going to do this in? And then I think the second thing that I would kind of hold our agencies and our training more accountable to is from the viewpoint of choices we make in the way that we approach our hobby or our recreation. And so I know for me, you're kind of like this is hard because there's a whole side of the business that then is tourism. So book a trip with us, right? And la la la. But I think also understanding the relationship between what we said in number one, the appreciation of something, by understanding the ecology of it and the history and so on and so forth, that's an area, again, that we can better prepare divers for. And I think that it all comes back down to the biggest portion, which is making open water just too darn fast, right? And too much, it's too fast, too equipment focused, and not enough on the diver's mindset, the diver's readiness to approach a wild environment. And I think that all of that has been done to try and get more and more people through the front of the funnel. But then the back end of that is, well, our biggest problem in scuba is retention. And that's because we're not preparing divers to be in this environment, to appreciate it from an educational perspective, because we're rushing them through their open water. So, or at other trainings as well. It takes 3 days, and now here's your advanced card. I think that contributes to the lack of retention, because we don't get full appreciation of the activity we're actually undertaking. So there's my little a take on how the educational interpretation features that agencies have to play in preparing divers to actually go out into these environments.
No, I'm right there with you, and I think that was very well said. Your point that it's not entirely the agency's responsibility to cover every single little environmental nuance of what they go into is a really interesting point too, because taking your example of like the parks and staying on the trails with the bears, it's the same thing when you get on a dive boat to your destination, is that you get another brief of, hey, stay off the coral, don't stick your hands out and try and put your finger inside of a shark's mouth, don't touch the sea turtles. And those all make really good reminders, but you see people who are still, it doesn't quite grasp right there at the very moment before they jump in the water. So I think emphasizing our interactions with nature in the classroom before these students even get on the boat will do much more to solidify the idea in their mind without having to add on all that extra stress of remembering that whole dive brief right before they get in the water, especially for newer divers. But it's true that the dive industry's main concern right now, aside from the environmental factors, is retention. And those 3-day long courses that do so little to prepare divers is not only bad for the industry as far as retention goes, but it's also bad for the environment. There's a couple studies that I had pulled up here as well that talk about divers and our interactions with the ecosystems and the coral reefs that we dive on. And one study that they did in the Philippines was that they shadowed 100 divers of varying skill levels, anywhere between total beginner to about 100 dives. And they found that 88% of them made physical contact with the coral reef.
88%?
88% of them. And that's only one study, because I got another one here that says it's even higher, up to 91% of the divers made physical contact with the coral reef.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you looking at these and looking at the statistics of the one that says 91%, I want to point out that it does say that only 7% of them appeared to cause skeletal breakage on the coral. But even still, I mean, 90, take the low number, right? Take 88%, or even round it down, give the benefit of the doubt. 80% of divers making contact with the coral reef on a dive. That is a very significant amount. That
Yeah.
8 out of 10 divers are touching the coral when they're not supposed to. There's something wrong with that.
Yeah. Well, and I think they define it a little farther in that definition. We'll get to it here specifically, the impact there. But I think on the educational piece, this is where like you say, the local dive shop, the dive guide, right, the dive boat, the operation can really close a gap here, because I think the knowledge base there is, okay, it's not just a rule, don't touch the turtle. That feels like a rule, and then my natural inclination is to touch the turtle because someone told me not to, right? That's not a good presentation of the reason behind it. It's, hey, when we touch the turtles, here's the impact that has on this ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
When we break coral that took hundreds of years to grow, here's the impact that has on the ecosystem in this location. I'll give a really stupid example here that bothers me, but there's a lake in Texas called Lake Travis, and there's a site called Windy Point that a lot of a huge amount of divers in Central Texas know this spot, and it's where a lot of open water dives take place. And one of the practices that has kind of happened there, because there's a little shop. It's not really a shop; it's a stand. But you check in, you pay to go in. They have some, snacks and Gatorade, and all that. They sell these little Vienna sausages, little weenies.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about, and instructors there have got into kind of a habit, or some, I should say, not all, of saying, hey, if you do well in your open water checkout dives, on the fourth dives, you can take some of these Vienna sausages down and feed the fish. And you go, okay. And it's funny because if you wear gloves at all and you're at your whatever 10-foot stop, 20-foot stop, all these little sunfish that are around come up and nibble your fingers because they look like, guess what, Vienna sausages, right? And there's an influence there. And I say that as a funny story, that I always get my fingers nibbled when I'm in that site because of that. But it kind of comes back to the educational aspect of teaching about that local dive site and why that's probably not a good idea, right? To do that in a lot of different ways. Yet in your open water class, oh, my instructor, we're interacting with the wildlife, and we're feeding them, and this is what diving must be. Sets that expectation in some ways. So again, I think that the gap of the local instructor, the local dive guide, the local dive operation, and expressing why feeding, for example, the sunfish weenies is not a good idea, because one, that's not a natural food to them. Two, right, it's going to make them dependent upon that food source for survival in some ways, or it's going to overgrow that population because that ecosystem can't sustain that many sunfish without the weenies in it, so on and so forth, right? I'm just kind of having fun with this story, but you get my point.
This goes on all the way to don't feed the alligators or crocodiles while you're visiting Florida.
Right, exactly. Like, which seems like a no duh, but it's
People
not.
do it.
So again, I think explaining not just the rule, don't touch the whatever, but the impact. Not say don't touch the sea turtle, but instead say, if you touch the sea turtle, here is the impact that it has on this environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a good question to ask. Does the person giving the dive briefing on the boat actually know what happens? And if not, that's a gap of education, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think anybody who jumps in the water to go diving to explore the reef and experience the reef is looking to do damage. I think it really just does come from an innocent ignorance out of it, and that's where that education, that gap, really comes in, and as leaders of the industry, the leaders of the industry really are the agencies. They're the ones that run the whole show. So what steps do they take as far as just that general education goes? Because you can have, like you said, different environments. You don't need to talk about caves in open water class, but where do most of your open water divers go? They get certified and then they go on vacation to these tropical locations with coral reefs and sharks and dolphins and turtles. And there's no emphasis on the amount of potential damage they can do if they don't take their training seriously and their skills seriously. So that's something that I think when they were taking these statistics about how many of the instructors think that the environmental awareness portion of the courses are and how little it's actually talked about, I think that's where that gap really comes from, is why aren't the agencies discussing or changing their practices to make divers capable of not destroying the reef?
Yeah.
Because in those same studies that I was talking about for the divers that did make physical contact with the reef, they noted that there were multiple parts of the divers, including their hands, bodies, and parts of the equipment that all made physical contact and contributed to destruction of the reef. But the biggest one that the researchers noted in this specific study was fins. And that's something that you and I both know is why are fins the biggest contributor? What about the divers' training is making it so that fins are constantly being an issue for the preservation of these reefs?
Yeah, let's pocket that one for number 4 on this list, because I think there's a lot to say there. That's a good tee.